Okay, I think we can start. There are also many people connected online, so we don't want them to wait too much. Let me welcome all of you in presence and all those connected online to this Bruegel event on nationalism, geoeconomics, protectionism, and energy shocks. And how should you respond? I'm Carlo Altomonte. I'm a professor of economics at Bocconi University and non-resident fellow at Bruegel. And we have the pleasure today to be hosted by the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Italy, and Riccardo Barbieri is the Director General of the Treasury. So let me thank him twice for hosting us and for being present in our panel. Then we have also Jeremy Zettelmeyer, our Director at Bruegel. And Isabel van Steen-Kiste, who is the Director General of International European Relations at the European Central Bank, is currently stuck in a meeting in Frankfurt. As you can imagine, it's a pretty busy day today in Frankfurt, so she should be joining us later, hopefully. So just a few introductory remarks on this new series of events that is happening every day around us. And I will then ask our panelists to have a first round of opinions on this, and then we will go on discussing. And there will be time also to ask questions, both from the people attending here and also online attendance. Please, you can type your question on Slido, and as usual, we will pick them up and report them to the panelists. So just write your question as long as we go. Now, clearly, we live in a world which is changing in a quite important ways. We have abandoned, it seems we have abandoned the flat world of the global environment that started after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the creation of the World Trade Organization, a rule-based system where globalization was having prevalence on every other economic phenomenon. There was great moderation, inflation was low, interest rates were bound to be very close to zero. Companies were competing on efficiency, on the ability to export, and fragmenting the value chain all over the world. Where there was competition rules on preventing and making sure that the companies were respecting somehow basic economic principle, where efficiency was sought after, where markets were running more or less free. All this seems to have changed due to a series of economic shocks, which have put into question the viability and the robustness of that model. These shocks clearly are the pandemic first, that has shown the inherent fragility of some parts of the globalization process. Then clearly the geopolitical implications, which are still to be understood, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And if you allow me also the climate change, which is forcing serious rethinking of the way we produce and consume throughout the planet. So if you put all these things in perspective, the new world that is emerging seems to be inherently more inflationary because of a number of reasons that we might want to explore with the panelists. Is a world in which rather than efficiency, there seems to be more of a tendency toward strategic autonomy in a way. Is a world where rather than being rule-based and oriented to free trade, countries are much more assertive in their own national or continental industrial policies. And a world in which globalization, and this is also emerging from a number of studies, might change its nature, going from a flat, unique arena to a world in which regional areas might emerge. So more intra regional trade, less inter-regional trade. So not necessarily less trade per unit of GDP, but less kilometers in the distance of the trade flows per unit of GDP. So not necessarily the trade openness indicator that we are all using and looking as not changing are the right indicator to that extent, because behind that trade openness indicator, there might simply be a reshuffling of the production networks. To tell you the truth, the evidence that we are having and measuring, and here I sort of put on my academic hat, is that we have seen some reshuffling, if I might say, of trade flows over the last couple of years, but not a reshoring of a production process. So basically, if you imagine globalization as a set of nodes which trade in a network among each other, the position of the nodes, which is the location of foreign investments and the location of multinational companies in the world, is not changing. We don't see evidence of this yet, but the intensity with which the nodes are trading is changing and has changed already during the pandemic. We have observed, for example, in Asia, a withdrawal of the role of China in the trade intensity of within the Asian region, and the takeover of Korea and Japan, replacing some of the suppliers that the Chinese were unable, the supply that the Chinese were unable to produce because of the zero COVID policy that was implemented in the country. In Europe, we do observe that European suppliers are receiving higher orders from European and US multinationals, because European and US multinationals are now sourcing less from Asia than they used to be. That doesn't necessarily mean, again, that the location of investment is changing, but the orientation of trade flows is changing. And this reorientation, so to use an academic term, we are adjusting on the intensive margin of trade, how much we trade and with respect to where, rather than on the extensive margin of the value chain, i.e. where our production processes are located. Now, clearly, all these calls, or might call for a different approach, and this is what I would like to start asking to our panelists, a different approach which is both different in terms of industrial policy, or might be different in terms of industrial policy, more assertive maybe from the Commission, to what extent we can use the existing rules on state aids, competition policy, and to what extent we need to change in order, as Europeans, in order to, let's say, adapt to this new environment. This is an open question, whether we need to change that. And also, from a more macro financial perspective, the idea that this world, and this is probably a given, is inherently, as I said, more inflationary than before. Reshoring and reshuffling of trade flows in value chains leads to higher inflation rates, and therefore also a change in monetary policy, and in general in the way in which central banks and government tackle their economic policies. And finally, where do we get the sources, the financial sources to finance this new approach, which could be less relying on companies exporting abroad and more relying on internal consumption and investment, more related and as also stimulated by the green transition. So these are a number of, let's say, questions that stem from a very broad analysis of the current environment. And I would like our two panelists to react on that. Maybe we can start with the more European overview. So I will ask Jeremy to intervene first. And then I will ask Riccardo Barbieri to give us more the Italian perspective, also in light of all what he can observe from his vantage point. Jeremy, thank you.
Thank you so much. So, as some of you know, the European Commission will present today two pieces of legislation, or two legislative proposals. One is called the Net Zero Industrial Act, or Net Zero Industry Act. The other one is called the Critical Raw Materials Act. and they are supposed to be essentially a robust response, a robust industrial policy response to what we have seen as, protectionist state intervention in other countries. So I want to get to these pieces of legislation at the end, but let me just basically put it a little bit into context. So the immediate, the broader context for all of this is two challenges. One, as you know, the rise of China. We're using a playbook of economic policies which is very old, right? So it goes back, I think the oldest clean draft of that playbook is by the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, who in the early 1790s published a very remarkable short book called The Report on Manufactures, where he basically lays out an industrial policy to build up a manufacturing sector in the United States against the dominance of the British Empire. And he basically goes through various manufacturing sectors and he calculates sector by sector what sort of subsidies might be needed to grow these sectors. So there is a very old intellectual tradition out there that if you are the underdog and you want to develop industrially, you might have to go through a greater extent of state intervention, including by supporting your industry in some way, than if you already have those capabilities, right? And this playbook has been followed by many countries since then with varying success. So the rule of thumb is that when Latin American countries have tried it, it usually hasn't worked. When Asian countries have tried it, they've done it a little bit differently. They've done it more export-oriented, less about substituting for imports. They may possibly paid more attention to competition, or possibly this was only a side show of the fact that they do it externally. And so, we have seen Japan rise in this way. We have seen Taiwan and Korea rise in this way with some combination of these things, and now it's China, right? But with China, of course, it is also a very large country. It's potentially a military threat. It's an authoritarian system, and so we are all a bit more concerned. Plus, the use of subsidies has been very aggressive in China. And so China has established market dominance in some product lines, like, for example, solar technology, and not just through their own subsidies or through their own skills, but also because of a demand push that was partly driven by subsidies here in Europe when we subsidized our solar industry. So this is sort of the first element. The second element is the reaction of the United States to this. So normally, we have seen the type of economic nationalism that I've just described from the new entrant, right? From the still less developed country that, in a sense, doesn't yet want to play by completely fair rules because it is weaker. So in order to get up to that capacity of competing on what may be a level playing field, maybe there is a sense, at least on the side of that country, that you can justify nationalist, protectionist tools. Now, what we kind of saw when President Trump came to power was, I think, for one of the first times, I'm not sure if it was the first time, but certainly one of the first time where, in a sense, the idea of economic nationalism, protectionism, was adopted defensively by a very large, very developed country that was worried about its decline. And, this changed a very great deal because the United States had, after it had gone through industrialization, partly by using tariffs and subsidies, adopted the same view that the British Empire had in the 19th century, which is, let's do the level playing field, let's have openness, trade benefits everyone, and so forth. And so to see the main sponsor of this system of open trade and level playing field and limited intervention to help your own companies sort of turn around in the Trump era was a bit of a shock. And what was an additional shock is that the Biden administration did not fully repudiate this approach. So the Biden administration is obviously a much friendlier and much more multilaterally oriented administration. It's been a great ally for Europe, particularly against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in one area, they have simply continued with the Trump policies, and that is trade policy. And so this is now the background for what was come to be called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is an ambitious climate package that was finally enacted in the summer. And what the United States is doing in this climate package is it's getting serious about climate action, but it is doing so mainly through subsidies and trying to channel these subsidies in a way that is supposed to help mostly American production and American workers. Okay, so it is, you could see it as a political compromise between wanting climate action, which in order to get it as fast as possible, you would do in a very open, trade open way, because you want to, quickly deploy technologies that already exist. But, unlike some of the European subsidies for renewable energy sources, they do not want the benefits of this to go to China. And so there are some tough anti-Chinese provisions. And more generally, there are so-called domestic content requirements in this act, which basically say that you can benefit from certain types of subsidies only to the extent that you both assemble goods in the US, but also that your value chain, so the intermediate goods that you use, that they are mostly sourced from the United States. Okay, now this is a very big deal, and one of the reasons why it's a very big deal is that this is a confrontation not only ideologically or philosophically with the principles that the US has been pushing since World War II, essentially, but it's also literally a confrontation, because these types of subsidies that you are coupled with so-called domestic content requirements are flatly prohibited by the World Trade Organization. So the US is basically saying, look, we really don't care about these rules anymore when it comes to essential US interests. Okay, so then the question is broadly, how should we react in Europe to this thing? So in Europe, I think we are in a somewhat special situation, because we are a continent that is relatively expensive for production. We have a very generous social protection system. We have high energy costs, high labor costs. And for these reasons, and unlike the US, we are not really a single market, right? We are some way towards a single market, but we don't have an internal economic area of quite the same size as the US. And so if our companies want to sort of achieve scale, they pretty much do that through world markets. And if they want to be competitive, they pretty much do that by either shifting some production abroad or by trading, by importing expensive intermediate goods. I mean, intermediate goods that would be more expensive to produce in Europe than outside. So our entire model of competitiveness relies on openness to trade. So this is, and on respect for trade rules, right? Because otherwise we could not sell our products abroad. That's true particularly for Germany and Italy, right? Which have traditionally very competitive manufacturing sectors within export markets. So we have, in a sense, a real vested interest in protecting the system, and we see the system being under threat from the new entrants, China, now from the United States, an incumbent, our ally and the sponsor of the system. So it is sort of a little bit of a disconcerting and shocking development. Now, it's not completely new, right? I mean, this started in 2016, 2017, if not before, during the Trump campaign and when after he was elected. And so we have seen sort of this debate, at least since then, if not before. So how should we react? So we can talk about the specifics a bit later because we will have several discussion rounds, but very broadly, I think you can think of it as three categories of reaction. So I'm all in favor of reacting. So this is not, I'm not trying to preserve the status quo, but one option would be to react by, if you like, pushing the envelope within the status quo. And that is by using some tools that we already have that are explicitly allowed under the European treaties, that could also be consistent with World Trade Organization rules, to undertake industrial policy. And so typically what we have tried to do for a while now is to promote areas, including with subsidies, that we think have spillovers, that have implications for economic development more broadly in the European Union. And so these are areas which one would typically link to innovation, right? So there's a tendency to under-innovate because innovations have spillovers that you do not get back necessarily as the innovator, or things like product development, or the combination of the two in the green area. So there is sort of essentially an established consensus that these things are okay to subsidize, and those things can be subsidized under EU rules. So we could go in there, into this area, we could try to take another look at it, maybe to push it further. But above all, what we could do is try to use this challenge to maybe look a bit more deeply at the structural reasons why we're behind the US in the first place. And that is basically the lack of a true single market. We are too fragmented. We are very fragmented, particularly in the financial area. We don't have a big internal capital market, which the US does. The standard story is always that we have good innovators here, but then once they achieve a certain scale, they go to the US because that's where they get the big funding. You know, what if they got the big funding here? And of course, we have a skills issue. So you could take an approach that this is sort of the wake-up call to finally get serious about addressing these structural disadvantages vis-a-vis the US, combined with some judicious use of existing tools. And potentially with more money at the European level, which we can get to the extent that we pursue a fiscal centralization agenda, which I think we should do. So this is, in a sense, this kind of mainstream approach, which my think tank would normally stand behind. Then there is a view that, you know, this is not enough. And it may not be enough because it's not focused enough on the specific areas that are really our weakness and that may make us dependent. Okay, so example, COVID. So if you know COVID is coming and you know that you're going to need masks and there may be a shortage, then maybe there is really an approach, an argument to simply override the normal market-based mechanism and use a planning approach to address a specific area of critical need. Another area has to do with, you know, dependency on an unreliable trading partner for a critical input, right? So that is the Russia energy example that is always used. Now, of course, in the case of Russian energy, this wasn't necessarily, I think, an example of a market failure, that sort of the market economy by itself became too dependent on Russia. This is mostly a policy failure, right? Because several governments, particularly the German government, pushed Russia as an energy source. But this is an area where, you know, direct intervention may make sense. So you identify a critical threat, you intervene more directly, and you use this as a complementary approach to the first type of approach. And then there's the third possible response. And the third possible response is to say, look, if we are the only ones left in the world that still believe in open trade, fair competition, and all the rest of it, we're going to get screwed. So this is the sort of the approach of saying, you know, let's stop turning the other cheek. Let's become like them. And let's just do this protectionism, maybe the subsidies. In any case, let's no longer think in this paradigm that we create a level playing field, we do open trade, we then think that this suits us, that, you know, the market takes over, occasionally we nudge. No, we do a different paradigm. The paradigm is we need 40% at least of our own production in a particular area. Why? Not necessarily because we have done a deep study that this is an area where someone is going to extort us. Just because we think this is a growth area and we should have a portion of the value chain. We should have the jobs that do it. We should be in the game. We should simply, you know, because it's modern, it's important, it's related to the green transition, we need to have a big productive capacity across the board. And so this is essentially the economic nationalist, also a little bit planning philosophy that some of the others are using, definitely China, not really the United States. I mean, the United States uses economic nationalism in tools, but they don't have planning targets on how much they want to do. So this third approach is a paradigm shift. Okay, so where we are right now in Brussels is in a confused state between these three approaches. And that is partly because people disagree, even inside the Commission. So there's sort of a sense in the Commission that they want to have it always. They want to keep some of this openness, transition model, because it has worked for European prosperity. And let's face it, this is the model that preserves peace. This is the model that preserves fairness between countries that don't necessarily love each other all the time. Here, right? So it's been a winning model for us. So there's some reluctance to simply toss this out. And the other hand, there's a very strong push to just say we have to stop turning the other cheek. And so that involves adopting the more nationalist, the more ruthless approach of some of the others, okay? And what we will see today when this package is published is how far the Commission has gone down into that third area. My guess is they will go down further than they ever have and than I ever expected, at least 4 weeks ago, before I read the draft, which I found pretty shocking. And I think this is a mistake. So I think that if you are going to go unconventional, it is the burden on you to show how you're going to minimize the unintended consequences. And I don't think the Commission has thought about this seriously. And the speed with which they have produced this thing without any proper consultation argues for that. So I'm very worried. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, for a very analytical thinking of what is happening also with respect to the EU policy debate. I would love to hear what Ricardo thinks about whether we should, let's say, stay within the current set of rules or be more bold, let's say, in our policy proposal, where the Italian economy would probably benefit. What is the scenario in which the Italian economy you think and would benefit most?
Thank you. Well, being constantly torn between different very practical issues, I cannot perhaps express a strategic view similar to or analysis like Jeremy's statements, which were very, very interesting. I think we do need to have someone who reminds us about the philosophy of the European project and why we benefit from globalization and multilateralism. So I do believe that we should uphold those values. It's becoming increasingly difficult, and I think it's becoming increasingly difficult because whereas in the 90s we saw a diffusion of the market-based economic system, in the last 20 years, we've seen a gradual move towards what I would call state capitalism, or a more dirigist approach on the part of the emerging giants of the world economy. And for many years, we were perhaps a bit too laid back, a bit too relaxed about what it meant. Some countries adjusted very successfully, and I think Germany, until recently, can be said to have been quite successful because it continued its ongoing process of producing ever more value-added products, going up the value chain, and decentralizing productions where it no longer made sense to produce in Germany. And in particular, it was very successful in penetrating the Chinese market. Other countries were less successful, and I would put Italy in that camp. And that obviously is shown by the lower growth rates that Italy's had in the last 20 years. So Italy is, I think, a country that has not adjusted totally successful to this globalization. But we should not lose sight that our economy is probably more efficient today than it was 20 years ago. The sectors where we are specialized are really sectors where we excel. And we have experienced a decline in industries where perhaps we were not as competitive. So in terms of pure efficiency, I think we have benefited from openness and multilateralism. My observation about the European response is, in general, I would argue for thinking a bit more careful about solutions when we're dealing with such fundamental issues. And sometimes there was this perhaps over-activism on the part of the Commission without the necessary bottom-up approach of discussions among the member states. I mean, even in our day-to-day work, we are constantly reacting to, say, the Fit for 55. Before that was the Green Deal. And there's always a new paper, essentially by the month. And here, perhaps, we do have one of our weaknesses is that we haven't really developed a strategic capacity in economic policy. For some years, perhaps there was an idea that, okay, the prevailing trend is globalization, just need to stay the course, and we don't need to plan much. Clearly, when most of your competitors are adopting a different approach, call it state capitalism or call it more dirigist or call it simply more strategic, then the least one can say is you need to think how you're going to respond to this. Are there risks in terms of national security? Are there risks in terms of resilience of value chains? What are the employment implications? I think if you look only at one side of the story, then you miss the broad picture. So my view on this is that today, for instance, you cannot just look at the Ukraine war in isolation from the global value chains or the pandemic. You need to carefully consider what the Ukraine war means. Unless you think it will be over in 3 or 4 months. If you think that here there's a bigger confrontation, I think most observers would agree that there is now a clear confrontation where Ukraine is probably the epicenter of the Russia-Europe, let's call it conflict or disagreement in terms of models of economic and political organization. And then you have the issue of Taiwan, which is very important in the Asian dimension. And what role do the United States want to have in the Asian theater? How willing are they to go down to if necessary, to a confrontation with China. These are very big issues, and if you look at the economy without looking at the geopolitical dimension, as I said, I think you're missing one piece of the story. So what I would like to see is you know, I do welcome, in most cases, the excellent analysis that the European Commission carries out and how it tries to find common ground and a compromise between the approach to competition policy and industrial policy and the response to these strategic challenges. But as I said, we need to reflect very carefully about how we want to respond. And I don't think we want to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act in the US by adopting the same policies. First of all, it's not clear we can afford it. And in addition, it's not clear that it is necessarily the right approach, but clearly some companies at least might vote with their feet. They might say, look, for my next gigafactory or my next solar panel factory, you're giving me this much. The IRA offers in total over the life of the project a support which is a multiple of what I get in Europe. So it's quite difficult for us to avoid answering that question. We need to come up with a strategy. But as I said, the strategy must involve, you know, the procurement of critical raw materials, the energy supply, the military model, the environmental model. And so I would say today what I would argue is that perhaps if we take a little bit more time to think carefully about what we're trying to achieve, perhaps we can get to better results. And my impression is also that today European countries find it a bit more difficult to have a constructive dialogue because of their domestic political situation. And when the political situation in the different member states is a bit out of sync, or the leading countries tend to be more focused on their internal problems, then it becomes more difficult to come to a synthesis, to what I would call a successful strategy. And I think, given, you know, realistically, the fact that integration can only go that far, we must continue to uphold the values of multilateralism and free trade. Obviously, we cannot be, you know, the buffer from other, you know, from policies adopted in Asia or in the US, meaning we cannot take the full impact of those policies. So we will have to support certain industries. In fact, you know, in the Italian case, we have, for example, studied the semiconductor industry, and we have concluded that the government, in conjunction with European funding and the European Chips Act, needs to be a bit more proactive in the area of supporting research and innovation in that sector. This is not saying that we should give away money without carefully considering the efficiency of what we're doing, but clearly an effort in developing our scientific capabilities, our research and development, our competitiveness from a technological point of view, and the skills and the education of our population and our workforce are priorities. And we must do it quickly because, of course, these are not investments that have a return of, you know, within a year or 2 years. They're medium to long-term policies. And then in certain, as I said, industries where, you know, that are particularly important in order to achieve our ecological transition goals and digital transition and security, then obviously it is justifiable that we selectively intervene. But clearly, one concern that Italy has is how the so-called fiscal space will affect the ability of different countries to intervene. And here, clearly, if we do see joint action by France and Germany, although France and Germany have different degrees of fiscal space, obviously, we would like to be involved in that discussion and to understand exactly what the terms of this relaxation of state aid are. And there's also the lingering question of having a European Union a facility to intervene in certain strategic sectors. So should we do it as a European initiative rather than a standalone initiative? It's clear that there are scale economies. Scale matters. And each European country is too small to really be a credible competitor to China, India, or the United States. So clearly we need to join forces. But once again, I think we need to be very careful about how we design these policies. We cannot continue changing or adding elements, because we must also be mindful of the capacity of our public sector to drive that strategy. And also, we must create a stable investment climate. I think today, especially in some industries, the job of a CEO is really very, very complicated, because until a few years ago, it was all about globalization. As Jeremy said, the key for European companies was to achieve growth by going global, by being highly integrated on a global basis. Now, the geopolitical environment, imagine how many multinationals, for example, have had to rethink their presence in Russia. They're now having to think about their presence in China as well. And how about India? In India, you have to go in primarily with joint ventures. So the price to be paid is that you have to disclose, to disseminate to share your technology, and you're at risk of losing your edge by being more involved. So there are all these very complex issues, but I'm trying to come to a conclusion, and what I'm trying to say is my recommendation would be that we do focus our intervention on sectors where there's a very strong case to be more interventionist. We use public sector resources very carefully, and we try to really have a very broad dialogue among the leading EU countries on every aspect before we can finalize joint initiatives. It's important the Commission takes the initiative, but as I said, at the end of the day, the dialogue between, say, the 5, 6 major European economies is critical, in my opinion, for the success of these policies.
No, thank you. Thank you. And I think this is clearly within, let's say, one of the strategic options that Jeremy put out, i.e. this idea of more targeted interventions on certain critical areas, which is also a scenario that the same Jeremy didn't rule out as a possible framework, without going to the extreme of the economic nationalism that doesn't serve the interest of the EU. But both of you mentioned, and that's my second question, if we may want to have a quick second round of reactions, that having those strategic targeted intervention in certain areas requires financial means. And on the financial means, clearly, there are a number of potential approaches, and Riccardo was mentioning them. Either we relax the state aid framework, but that risks of unbalancing the single market because of the different fiscal capacity of member states. Or we might go through a European, some centralized fiscal capacity, but there is a lot of disagreement, clearly, and many member states point out to the fact that there is, and actually a very nice study by Bruegel shows that there is a lot of state aids already going on and lots of resources already within the European space that might be used more efficiently. So the position of many member states is, why don't you use the structural funds, the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, better and fully before asking for additional European central capacity. Now, to me, the new proposal of which apparently are going through also in the ECOFIN Council, but here Riccardo can tell us a bit more about the new fiscal governance of the EU, go in a way in that direction, because the new fiscal governance allows for a more, let's say flexible adjustment to the debt path, conditional on the fact that those reforms and investments are undertaken in member states. And I think since the Commission should be behind the monitoring of those reforms and investment, those reform and investment should address those critical areas in which the member state and in general Europe is lacking behind. So potentially, if the Commission asks the same reforms and investment embedded in the fiscal governance framework to every member state, you would end up with an industrial policy from the bottom rather than the top, because you would be, every member state would be addressing exactly the same, let's say, critical constraint. I would like to know what is your sense of the current debate, because this is another key piece of the legislation that is about to be put forward, and that has, to me, clear links with industrial policy. To me, it's not only any more fiscal framework and stability, which is clearly central in our story. Debt has to be sustainable before we start everything else. But this sustainability can be made compliant with the need to have a slightly more interventionist policy, probably within the new set of rules. I would like to have your opinion on that. We might reverse the order. Maybe Riccardo wants to answer first, as he's fresh from the ECOFIN, and then Jerome with his view.
Well, the Eurogroup ECOFIN were very focused on a last-minute negotiation on the Council conclusions, and fortunately, an agreement was found, and so we do have conclusions that will allow the European Commission to then propose new regulations, amending the existing Stability and Growth Pact. Obviously, having conclusions, that is, having a statement, with vague language, you can accommodate different views. I think there's clearly a group of countries that support the proposal of the Commission in the paper that was published in November. And I would definitely put France and Spain in that camp, Italy with some qualifications, to say the least, plus a number of other countries. And then there's a group of countries that are more cautious, and in particular Germany argues that we should continue to have common benchmarks and let's call them quantitative rules within this fiscal governance system. Now here the dilemma is that if you keep all the things we already have, we are not reforming. So if you maintain the medium-term objective, and the idea that the budget should be balanced over the business cycle, and that you should reduce debt by, say, 1/20th of the excess of a 60% per annum, or perhaps even a bit more slowly, but still something resembling that, that rule, then effectively you have not changed the system. On the other hand, the new system, I guess, leaves some countries a bit puzzled and not totally convinced, because, as you may know, it's based essentially on a debt sustainability analysis, which starts from the last year, for which the Commission has a projection for the fiscal balance of each member state. And then if the DSA shows that there is a risk, a reasonable risk of a rising debt to GDP ratio profile over the years, then requires the member state to move towards a primary surplus that will be, on a structural basis, large enough to guarantee that this DSA, debt sustainability analysis, is then successful. In other words, the debt will decline over time, but it doesn't set a specific target in terms of how much you must reduce your debt to GDP ratio in each year. And the rule, that the operational rule that governs the system, is an expenditure rule on the, arguably or probably, on the expenditure target that the Commission is already using. So expenditure net of interest payments, net of cyclical unemployment expenditure, and minus the changes in discretionary revenue policies. Which means if you want your expenditure to grow faster, as long as you compensate with higher taxes, a higher share of revenues over GDP, you're free to follow a policy of higher growth in public expenditure. I think the new proposal has the advantage that it focuses on medium-term planning. It focuses attention on public expenditure, on controlling the nominal dynamic of public expenditure. And then the deficit reduction, and therefore also the tendency towards the reduction in the debt to GDP ratio, follows from the adherence to this moderate growth in nominal expenditure. Obviously, I mean, we could discuss the details, the issues that this poses. I think for quite a long time, there has been a long period of gestation of this proposal, even in closed-door seminars. So it doesn't come out of thin air. It comes out of a long process of reflection on existing fiscal rules. I think from the standpoint of the Italian government, the key question is, how much room do we have to expand investment in the green transition, digital transition, and given the changed situation in defense? In parallel, the defense ministers have confirmed the commitment to raising military expenditure, defense expenditure, to 2% of GDP. But it's no longer a goal that's expressed over an unspecified future. From what we understand, it's meant to be achieved by 2024, and if not, soon after. In the case of Italy, this means raising defense expenditure by 0.6% of GDP. And doing that, I mean, in recent years, as we all know, France had a slightly higher share of defense expenditure over GDP, but the likes of Germany and Italy were always between 1.1, 1.2. And in the case of Italy, we are a bit heavy in terms of personnel expenditure and a bit thin in terms of investment and operating costs. So the question, though, once again, I go back to my obsession with the strategic element of what we do. It's not yet totally clear to me. Maybe it's not supposed to be in the public domain, but exactly what do we want to do with that 0.6% additional, or whatever? For some countries, it could be a 0.8% of GDP or additional expenditure. In any event, we must accommodate it. But on the other hand, when Minister Lindner says, finance minister of Germany, says debt is debt. So even if you spend for investment for noble goals, as long as you're doing it in deficit, you are increasing your public debt. So we need to, again, meet somewhere in the middle, close to the middle, between two different views. One is to tend to forget what this all means in terms of the debt to GDP profile, and the other is to be very focused on the deficit, on the debt implications of whatever new rule we adopt. One thing is clear to me, again, it's the same thing as when we were discussing state aid. We are not thinking about, we shouldn't be thinking about this in a vacuum. We don't live in a little Europe that doesn't interact with the rest of the world. The world around us is that the United States have not paid too much attention to the level of public debt in recent years. Japan is at, what, 260% of GDP or thereabouts. China's public debt is a mystery. You know, we can discuss about what is the debt of the general government, given the provinces, the finances are a mystery. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was much higher than what is officially reported. And so, you know, 60%, we are not touching it because it would open Pandora's box. But there's no question that we are in an era where public debt is a lot higher than only a few years ago, and certainly much higher than before the global financial crisis. And we cannot be the only area that obsesses about very low debt levels. Then finally, I think the Italian viewpoint, the viewpoint of the government and of our finance minister is also that what I mentioned earlier, the European dimension of budget policy should not be lost in this process. In other words, we do think there is a European fiscal stance, as there is a monetary stance. Yes, it is the aggregation of what individual countries do, but clearly, if some very important countries, also from a quantitative point of view, run a restrictive policy, then this fiscal stance might not be appropriate in certain conditions. Obviously, right now, we have the problem of unwinding the debt accumulation that took place in just 1 year during the pandemic. So in the case of Italy, it was 20 points of debt to GDP ratio. So a very dramatic increase in public debt. Over the past 2 years, we've been able to recover 10.2 points. But from now on, clearly, we cannot expect the economy to continue growing by 6-8% in nominal terms in each year, and that to do the job for us. So clearly, that calls for gradual, as we call it, fiscal consolidation. And I think, you know, personally, what I would like to see is that we manage over time to focus more on the quality of expenditure, on making difficult decisions between different priorities, on making our government expenditure more efficient so that we can free up space to make these investments. Then obviously one can take different views. Is this increase in defense expenditure something that will structurally be with us for the coming decades, or is it a temporary phase? Of course, my own wish is that it is a temporary phase, but we cannot, it's hard to predict how long this confrontation between, say, more liberal systems and less liberal systems will go on for. And we must be prepared for that. But obviously that will entail changes in our industrial structure. And again, that must be incorporated in whatever we decide, also in terms of other policies like green and digital transition.
Thank you, Riccardo. I would love to hear briefly from Jeremy on this, because coming in from Germany, might have different views. I was thinking that I was thinking that we could hire military and put them into Italian municipalities to run the national recovery plan, and we would achieve both goals of increasing the public expenditure in defense and undertaking the recovery plan. But I don't want to be too creative on that. So, Jeremy, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm certainly German enough to agree with Minister Lindner that debt is debt. But I actually also agree with most of what Ricardo has said before. I would just maybe make the argument from I would get to the results slightly differently. So in my view, the fiscal constraints are obviously, the fiscal rules can be constraints on operational fiscal policy once they're there. That's the whole point of having them. But they're not primary constraints, right? We should think of them, or we should think of their design as a way of managing our fundamental constraints. So what are our fundamental constraints? Well, I think debt is in fact one of those constraints. So Ricardo is right, in the aggregate, it's not that high in the euro area, but in some countries, unfortunately, including Italy, it is quite high, and France is getting there pretty fast too. And so these are the second and third largest countries in the euro area. Then the other constraint that we have, unfortunately for basically a European federalist like me, is that we do have a deep principle in the treaties that sovereignty is at the national, fiscal sovereignty is a national state matter, right? And so that prevents us from essentially, using the fiscal space of one side of Europe for the benefit of everyone, right? So how do we get out of there? Well, we need to have two agendas. One is to push the federalization, I think. So I'm in favor of a fiscal capacity. I'm in favor of European public goods. We have to make an efficiency argument, not a redistributional argument for having such public goods. And then we may have to face the consequences of actually sticking by efficiency. So we have to make it not on the basis, in an emergency like COVID, you can make an argument for fiscal redistribution in normal times. Given where we start from, you cannot. So it has to be an efficiency case, and so that's part of the agenda. But this is a slow process. So in the meantime, we need to manage those two constraints. And here, I think that the design of the new fiscal governance framework is really important, because what we cannot do is to add sort of new artificial constraints on top of all the real problems that we have, okay? So it has to be a smart system. I think that basically what the Commission has put forward is a smart system with, many details to be worked out. And so the one area in which it is quite smart, and I agree here with Carlo and also Ricardo on that one, is how it treats investment. So think about it. While we have fiscal responsibilities mainly at the national level, and while we have a debt constraint, there is going to be some need to create incentives for prioritizing investment expenditures over non-investive expenditures at the individual level. One sort of easy way to do it would be to take them out of the rules completely, right? That's the famous golden rule argument. But actually that's a bit irresponsible, because debt is debt. So instead, what you do, and this is really quite clever in the Commission's proposal, is you say you can, by yourself, less pressure to lower your deficit if you come up with investments that not only sound good, but they sort of documentably increase your solvency in the future. So it's completely logical, because it's from the perspective of fiscal solvency. It's very much a thought within the principle that the primary objective of the rule is to make sure that every sovereign is solvent. And so then it's almost trivial to say, if you can come up with a reform, if you can come up with an investment that promotes that objective, you have to do less on cutting spending. So it creates an incentives to rebalance the structure of spending a bit in the right direction, right? And so in that sense, it is very significant. I think it's something we really should fight to preserve. It's also difficult to implement. It's going to be very difficult to implement, but we have to go through that. Now, having said that, of course, this on by itself is not going to do it. We will, in the broader picture, we will still, even if we had a European federal state, we would still be facing this nationalism challenge, and we would have to operate. And what would we do? Well, we would basically, the holy grail is to improve the single market, right? To make it more like the US in that sense, like to have a bigger scale, less frictions within the single market. And of course, the two important projects here, and I know that on this one, Ricardo is fully on board, I think, is banking union and capital market union, which are still stuck, right? And so we are going to have another go at these, because it is the financial conditions that makes the US so superior. And what we could do is to use the IRA as an excuse to get serious about this. But I'm afraid that this is something that's being squandered right now.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, I also agree that the IRA somehow forces us to, or should force us to be serious about what we really want to achieve in the medium term as a continent, putting together the industrial policy dimension with the fiscal framework. Although fortunately, probably all the legislative process is coming up at the same stage, which was not granted ex ante, because this fiscal framework debate could have come at a later stage or at an earlier stage, where probably the sensitivities would have been different, and then we would have been stuck in a bad equilibrium with a rigid set of rules compared to the needs that we all want to have. So the fact that everything is coming to play in the same ends, I think is an important thing. We still have time for one or two questions from the crowd, if you have any. Yes, I see one, so I see that two. Let's pick these two. There is a microphone coming. And I think, Jeremy, you have already answered to a question by Nico Kappens online, that it was saying that it's not only the defense expenditure, but also the other money for development cooperation and climate change. So we have to take into account in our investment framework. So the flexibility that we have to have. Please.
Thank you, Antonia Carparelli, former European Commission official, now teaching European policy at the university. Thank you very much for very interesting, stimulating presentations. And well, I would like to start with a reminder. This year is the 30th anniversary of the internal market. I have seen a lot of rhetoric material on the institution's website, but unfortunately, very little self-reflection on the area where we are dramatically lagging behind. Is capital market union, is banking union, it's energy union. I could go on for long. Now, unfortunately, I have not seen the package that the Commission is presenting today, if I understand. And I would really like to
Only Jeremy has seen it. So.
Okay.
I have not, but several drafts have been leaked.
Yeah,
you
okay.
can find
I have
them
not
online.
been part of the network of the leaks, I'm sorry. But I really had a hope that the central point of the reaction of the Commission to the IRR, to the US IRR, would be a wake-up call on the need to relaunch the internal market and to have a new stimulus. Apparently, well, I understand the mood in domestic politics is not going that direction, but I really would like to understand what is behind the deep concern that Mr. Sattermeyer has expressed as regards the package which is coming today. Thank you very much.
Okay, and the other question there, and then we have a quick round because I don't want to be too late with our audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Periteo with AICGS and Uli Marconi here in Rome. My question just picks up where you left it, Ms. Altomonte. It's basically, you mentioned the fact that both proposals on a possible relaxation of state aid rules on one hand and the Stability and Growth Pact are on the negotiating table at the same time. And you seem to imply that is a good thing. I just wanted to ask sort of the spoiler question: how big is the danger instead of being a good thing, that we actually end up with a bad equilibrium in which there is a relaxation of state aid rules, and at the same time also stability and growth pact that doesn't take into account that debt is debt, as Mr. Lindner and Mr. Zettelmeier have just said. And we end up not achieving the goals that we are trying to achieve. Also conscious of the fact that even if the Stability and Growth Pact rules go in the direction of what the Commission has proposed, that in itself doesn't create enough probably of a fiscal space needed for the massive investments that, that may be necessary. Thank you.
Good point. Thank you. I leave it up to our panelists to answer. On the last question, I made
maybe I'll go first, and then Ricardo is last.
Yes.
Word. Okay, let me just say what I'm worried about. So basically, what the draft I saw, and by the way, there's a commentary on our website that discusses this a little bit. It's a bit like the IRA turned on its head. So the spirit is very much the same. So it's economic nationalism. It's about it's you know, the most important thing is production in the EU. So it's about all, you know, let's get as big a share of a value chain as possible. And sort of the weird, interesting thing about it is that it's about a specific value chain in a specific area, right? It's not a broader thing. And this is then justified by the fact that clean tech production, which is the type of production that is supposed to be promoted, is very closely linked to the climate transition. In fact, that's not really true, because, you know, we can have a boom in the climate transition, like was the case in Germany and other countries, without necessarily building the stuff ourselves, right? We would, of course, have to import from somewhere, but we have a boom going on right now in solar panels that is not being constrained by the fact that most of these solar panels are imported. Now, they can then argue, well, but we don't all want them to import them from China, which I agree with, but that's not the purpose either. So the purpose is not diversification. The purpose is simply to reshore a minimum of the overall demand and make sure it's being produced in Europe. And so from a perspective of the climate transition, it seems to me that if anything, this could be an obstacle, because if you want to, you know, quickly deploy renewables, you should not be at the same time worrying about where they're produced. You should just buy them as quickly and as cheaply as possible. The other thing that worries me about the Net Zero Industrial Act is the means with which this production jump is supposed to be achieved. And you can think of it as like creating special economic zones for these types of products, right? So they go through the whole reform agenda that you and I like, but they basically say, you should do these reforms for net zero clean tech projects, right? So it's not a broader competitiveness agenda. It's about giving these industries a leg up so we can reach that 40% target. So that is roughly where it comes from. And, you know, I also think it's a bad signal, because it is a protectionist document in motivation, if not in its means. And so it is, I think, a problem for our brand, because I do think that in Europe, we have to be a bit more subtle, because we are more dependent on openness and international integration than others. I think it's very easy to read this document and say, look, the Europeans, they always come across as holier than thou when they're talking about the Chinese or the Americans, but now look at this, it's just as bad. So that's what I'm worried about.
Ricardo.
I share the concerns expressed by Jeremy. I've not yet analyzed the latest proposals, but I do think, and I said it earlier, that our strength, we now have an economy that is perhaps smaller in some sectors, but more competitive. And we rely on foreign markets. I mean, let's not forget our trade surplus with the United States, I think is in excess of 40 billion euros. We have trade surpluses with most countries, except for Germany, the Netherlands, and the energy-producing countries. So we should be careful about undermining the areas of competitiveness that we have in our economy. But it's also clear that in some areas of industry, if we do not match, at least in part, the subsidies that, say, a semiconductor company gets in Asia, or whoever sets out to try and produce photovoltaic panels, and many other industrial products that are important for the digital and green transition, we are not going to go very far. So we need to be pragmatic, in my opinion. But once again, I do agree that our place is with openness, with multilateralism, with dialogue. This is what Europe does at its best. And also we should ensure that we preserve and actually foster further development of the single market. And clearly, going back to the key projects that we had, it's now 7, 8 years ago, Capital Markets Union, Banking Union, is also something that should be high on the agenda for the coming months or years, but hopefully the coming months. I would say that in terms of the other topic that's been touched upon, which is how do we treat investment? Yes, the new framework allows a member state to present a more gradual fiscal consolidation plan, provided the country also presents incisive reforms and investments that will improve the growth potential of the economy. Obviously, the tendency will be to say, okay, let me go for the 7-year option for this plan because I have to do less. And then to try and, find a way to present something that looks okay from a structural point of view, but it's not as good as it should be. So my strong recommendation is to take this 7-year option very seriously, because it is an opportunity to present something that increases the fiscal space for investment. And then my final thoughts, and then some of my colleagues have heard from me a number of times, is that I slightly disagree with the consensus view that the green transition requires huge investments. And when we talk about that, it means huge public investment. And the reality is it depends. It depends on how you carry out your policy. It depends on how much you rely on regulations as opposed to incentives. In other words, I mean, like we're doing in many Italian cities, we're saying after a given date, you won't be able to drive a certain type of car in the city of Milan or in the city of Rome. And that ultimately will mobilize demand for more efficient cars. So you don't need to give people money. Where do you need to give money? Where there is an element of inequality in the transition, and then you are compensating the distributional effects. But certainly, one weakness of what has been done in recent years, say with the property incentives, is that they were not means tested, they were not targeted. So it's obvious that in all likelihood, households, individuals with higher incomes have benefited more than those with low incomes. Only recently, the government has said, okay, for single family homes that are still applying for this 110% bonus, super bonus, so-called, you have to have an income of less than 15,000 euros. Now, it may be difficult to find that specimen around the system, but the intentions are good. In other words, to say, I'm still giving you this super bonus, but only if in cases where you have a clear need to be supported in making this investment. So something more targeted. So, my conclusion is the following. Take, for instance, infrastructure for sustainable mobility. It's not written anywhere It's not a law of economics that you have to do it all with public investment. There are grids, there are network systems where we have a regulator that sets what is viewed as a sustainable return on investments, and the pricing follows from that, and the private sector is investing in that infrastructure. We have an abundance of savings. Let's put them to work. That would be my suggestion. That means that, it doesn't look like public investment is our forte. I mean, we have not been able to really invest as much as we would have liked, at least in the last decade. So let's involve the private sector. And one of our colleagues, also Fabio Pamolli, has been very forcefully arguing that we should take advantage of the experience of InvestEU to design schemes where we can use private investment, but leverage it via public sector resources, including guarantees. And that will create a higher multiplier for the funds that we put to work. So in my opinion, a country can be smarter in the way it uses its resources. It's just a very difficult administrative and political challenge. But consider one thing. In recent years, the number of public sector employees in Italy has fallen more than in any other major European country. So we have an opportunity to use technology more effectively. We have an opportunity to be more selective when we hire very valid people, like some of them are in this room. But we hire bright people. We invest more on formation, on career development, and we try to create a more efficient public sector. At that point, that frees up resources. That is my wish for the coming years.
Thank you. And I think Jeremy had the last remark, and then we close. Yes.
Yeah, this was a great last word, Riccardo. Please, everyone, remember this as the last word, not what I'm about to say. But it was just, I had one thing that I forgot to say in response to Antonella, right? Your point. So just to make you sure that you don't think your former Brussels colleagues have gone completely mad. So the Commission did a good job, in my view, at defending state aid rules. So they did loosen state aid rules for this thing. So specifically for the IRA, not explicitly, but just as a way of sort of extending the existing temporary framework that was created after the invasion of Ukraine. So they basically took this thing and added an extra chapter that was published last week, but it's very narrow. So the main thing there is that it gives member states the permission, if they see that one of their companies is being bribed to go to a foreign country, it gives them the permission to do a counter bribe. But the conditions for doing that are quite narrow. So you have to show a whole bunch of stuff, including that this is not bad for cohesion, right? That this does not actually give you an advantage vis-a-vis other member states, and you cannot bribe more than what the company was offered. So no super bonus idea here, right? It's strictly the minimum. So I think, and other than that, there's a little more flexibility, but it's very tightly capped, 150 million or something per state. So that one I think was a good compromise. So there's clearly the will to defend the common market, the internal market by some. But there's also this view out there that we need to completely shift paradigms and just stop trying to be nice. And that one, I think, could have very dangerous unintended consequences.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks to both panelists, and thanks to you for the attention. Thanks to all of you who have attended online. I think that ends our workshop of today, and thanks again to Riccardo Barbieri for hosting us for the day, and I will meet you online or in person to the next Bruegel event. Thank you.